They are about to fire the janitor. The words drifted through the front office just loud enough for Ethan Walker to hear as he pushed his maintenance cart past the reception desk before sunrise. He did not stop. He did not look up. He simply adjusted the ring of old brass keys hanging from his belt and continued down the polished hallway, where the smell of fresh floor wax mixed with the familiar scent of sharpened pencils and coffee brewing in the teacher's lounge. Jefferson High School was still quiet. Lockers stood like silent rows of sentries waiting for another busy day, and sunlight had only begun to creep through the tall windows facing the football field. Ethan liked this hour because it belonged to no one else. Before students filled the corridors with laughter, before teachers hurried between classrooms, before announcements echoed through the speakers, the building felt peaceful. 7 years earlier, he had chosen this job because it allowed him to be close to his daughter while giving him enough time each afternoon to pick her up after class. That mattered far more to him than titles ever had. Most people who walked past him never learned his name. To them, he was simply the janitor, the quiet man who repaired loose desks, replaced burned-out light bulbs, carried heavy boxes, and somehow always appeared exactly where something needed fixing. Ethan never corrected anyone. Respect earned through kindness lasted much longer than respect demanded through status. At precisely 7:15, Principal Claire Bennett stepped into the main office carrying a folder thick with inspection reports. She looked composed, but the tension around her eyes betrayed weeks of pressure. Today, the State Board of Education would inspect Jefferson High, and the results could determine millions of dollars in future funding. Every classroom had to be ready. Every system had to work. Every staff member had to perform flawlessly. Claire greeted teachers with a professional smile before quietly entering the conference room where members of the school board were already waiting. Ethan passed the open doorway while replacing an air filter and accidentally overheard part of the conversation. "We have to reduce operating costs," one board member said. "Maintenance is the easiest department to trim." Another replied, "Automation has improved. One full-time janitor could probably be eliminated." Claire remained silent for a moment before speaking carefully. "I understand the numbers, but today is not the day to make staffing decisions." "Actually," another voice answered, "today is exactly the day. After the inspection, we expect your recommendation." Ethan quietly closed the vent cover and continued walking without changing expression. He had learned years ago that worrying about tomorrow only stole peace from today. A few minutes later, he reached the science wing, where a nervous freshman struggled to open an overstuffed locker. Books spilled across the hallway floor. Other students hurried past without stopping. Ethan parked his cart, knelt beside the student, and calmly gathered every notebook before adjusting the locker door with a simple screwdriver from his pocket. "Try it now," he said with an encouraging smile. The locker opened smoothly. "Thank you, sir," the student whispered. Ethan nodded. "Have a great day." No audience applauded. No one noticed except a security camera quietly recording another ordinary act of kindness. Upstairs, Claire stood before faculty members delivering final instructions for the inspection. "Please double-check attendance records, classroom technology, and student files," she said. "Everything must operate perfectly today." The room answered with confident nods. Then, without warning, every computer screen in the building flickered black. Smartboards shut down. Attendance software froze. Classroom printers stopped responding. The school's digital security system began displaying error messages one after another. Confused voices filled the hallways. Teachers refreshed screens that refused to respond. Office staff attempted to access student records only to discover every database had disappeared behind an endless loading symbol. Claire rushed into the main office. "Call District Technology Services immediately." The secretary picked up the phone with shaking hands. "They are already aware. Several schools are affected, but ours appears to be the worst." Minutes later, 2 information technology specialists arrived carrying laptops and diagnostic equipment. They worked quickly, exchanging increasingly worried glances as every attempt failed. "This should not be happening," one muttered. "The server is rejecting its own authentication." Another shook his head. "If we cannot recover the database before the inspectors arrive, the inspection cannot proceed." Outside the office, Ethan quietly finished replacing a broken ceiling tile before noticing anxious teachers rushing past him. He looked toward the technology office for only a moment. then calmly resumed pushing his maintenance cart down the hallway, as though the entire building had not suddenly begun holding its breath. The hallway that usually echoed with cheerful conversations had become strangely quiet as anxious whispers replaced morning greetings. Teachers hurried from classroom to classroom carrying laptops that no longer connected to anything useful, while office staff printed emergency forms only to discover the printers had stopped responding as well. Principal Claire Bennett stood in the center of the administration office watching years of careful preparation unravel 1 minute at a time. The inspection team from the State Board of Education was scheduled to arrive in less than an hour, and the school could not even access attendance records or student emergency contacts. One of the technology specialists leaned back from the server console and slowly exhaled. "We have isolated the problem, but we cannot restore the authentication database," he admitted. "Every recovery attempt is creating another error." Claire folded her arms, determined to remain calm. "How long do you need?" The specialist hesitated before answering. "If we are fortunate, perhaps several hours. If we are not, it could take all day." Claire looked through the office window towards students beginning to fill the hallways. The timing could not have been worse. Teachers were already improvising attendance with paper lists, counselors could not access student schedules, and the automated security doors had switched into restricted mode, forcing office assistants to unlock entrances manually. She quietly thanked the technicians before stepping into the hallway, hoping no one would notice the concern she could no longer hide. Meanwhile, Ethan Walker continued his morning routine with the same steady pace that never seemed to change regardless of what happened around him. He replaced a loose ceiling tile in the library, tightened the leg of a classroom desk that had been wobbling for weeks, and stopped only long enough to help a second-grade teacher carry several heavy boxes of donated books into her reading corner. "I do not know what we would do without you," she said gratefully. Ethan smiled politely. "You would find someone else willing to help." "I am not so sure," she replied. He simply nodded and continued down the hallway, pushing his well-used maintenance cart as sunlight stretched across the polished floor. His daughter, Lily Walker, waved enthusiastically as she passed with her classmates on the way to homeroom. "Have a great day, Dad." Ethan smiled warmly. "You too, sweetheart. Remember to be kind to someone today." She grinned. "I always try." Watching her disappear around the corner reminded him why every decision he had made during the past several years had been worthwhile. A larger paycheck could never replace afternoons spent helping with homework, listening to stories about science class, or eating homemade dinners together around their small kitchen table. Back inside the technology office, frustration continued to grow. Additional specialists had joined the effort, but every solution seemed to uncover another problem hidden beneath the first one. "The backup server is refusing synchronization," one technician said. "That should not even be possible," another answered. "Something inside the authentication sequence is looping." Claire listened carefully, even though much of the technical discussion made little sense to her. She trusted experts because she believed leadership meant knowing when someone else understood more than you did. Yet every passing minute increased the pressure from the waiting school board members. One member quietly approached her near the conference room. "This situation is unfortunate," he said, "but we still need your staffing recommendation this afternoon." Claire sighed softly. "Right now my priority is getting this school through the inspection. Budgets cannot wait forever," he replied before walking away. Claire remained silent, knowing exactly what he meant. Her eyes drifted toward the hallway where Ethan was carefully repainting a chipped section of wall outside the music room. He worked with remarkable patience, never rushing, never complaining, never drawing attention to himself. She had always appreciated his reliability, but if difficult budget decisions became unavoidable, loyalty alone might not be enough. The thought left an uncomfortable weight in her heart. A few students passed Ethan without noticing him, while another accidentally dropped a stack of notebooks rushing toward class. Before the teenager could even react, Ethan had already gathered every notebook, straightened the bent corners, and handed them back with a gentle smile. "Looks like you have an important day ahead." The student laughed nervously. "Everybody does." Ethan nodded. "Then take one thing at a time." The young man thanked him before hurrying away, carrying not only his books, but also a little less anxiety than before. Moments later, the loudspeaker chimed throughout the building. "Attention faculty," Claire announced. keeping her voice steady despite everything unfolding around her. Please remain flexible while we continue addressing technical difficulties. Thank you for your patience and professionalism. Her announcement ended, but uncertainty lingered in every classroom. Ethan paused beside a hallway window overlooking the front entrance just as several official vehicles turned into the parking lot. The state board inspectors had arrived exactly on schedule. He quietly glanced toward the administration office where worried faces gathered behind glass, then looked once more at the maintenance cart beside him before calmly walking toward the technology office, carrying nothing except a small screwdriver in his pocket and the quiet confidence of a man who had learned long ago that the greatest solutions often begin by listening before speaking. The arrival of the inspection team changed the atmosphere across Jefferson High in an instant. Office assistants greeted the visitors with polite smiles that barely concealed their concern, while teachers did their best to continue lessons without revealing that nearly every digital system in the building had failed. Principal Claire Bennett welcomed the officials with practiced professionalism, yet each handshake reminded her that time was slipping away. One inspector asked for attendance records. Another requested student performance reports. A third wanted to review emergency communication procedures. Claire answered every question honestly. Our technology team is currently addressing an unexpected systems outage, she explained. We are operating with manual procedures until everything is restored. The lead inspector nodded respectfully but made careful notes on his clipboard. We understand emergencies happen, he replied. What matters is how the school responds. Those words stayed with Claire as she led the group through the main hallway. Every classroom they passed reflected the determination of teachers who refused to let technology interrupt learning. Students solved math problems on whiteboards instead of tablets. English classes read printed novels instead of digital assignments. Science teachers demonstrated experiments using handwritten instructions. Despite the technical failure, education continued because dedicated people refused to stop doing their jobs. Ethan Walker quietly watched the inspection pass from the far end of the corridor while tightening a loose handrail beside the staircase. Several students greeted him by name as they hurried toward class. "Morning, Mr. Walker." He smiled warmly at each one. "Have a good class." A sophomore stopped beside him carrying a broken backpack with one torn strap. "Do you think this can be fixed?" Ethan examined it for only a moment before retrieving a small repair kit from his maintenance cart. Within minutes, the stitching had been reinforced, and the strap looked stronger than before. "There you go," he said as he handed it back. "Try not to overload it." The student grinned. "Thank you, sir." Ethan simply nodded and continued working as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Nearby, two teachers spoke quietly outside the faculty lounge. "I heard the board wants budget cuts," one whispered. "Maintenance is probably first." The other glanced toward Ethan before lowering her voice even further. "It is unfortunate. He is one of the hardest working people here." Ethan heard every word but showed no reaction. He had learned long ago that worrying about opinions accomplished very little. Character revealed itself over time, not through arguments. Inside the technology office, frustration continued to grow. One specialist rubbed his forehead while staring at endless lines of diagnostic information. "The authentication service keeps rejecting valid credentials," he said. "Every repair creates another failure." Another technician sighed. "I have never seen anything quite like this." Ethan quietly stepped into the doorway after finishing his work nearby. He did not interrupt. He simply observed the monitors for several silent seconds. His eyes moved calmly from one screen to another, following the sequence of messages with the patience of someone solving a familiar puzzle. One technician noticed him standing there and forced a tired smile. "Sorry, Mr. Walker. We are a little busy today." Ethan returned the smile politely. "I can see that." The technician chuckled without looking away from the keyboard. "If you know how to convince this server to cooperate, I would gladly hand you my chair." Several people laughed softly, assuming it was nothing more than a passing joke. Ethan smiled, but made no reply. Instead, he quietly noticed a small detail displayed in one corner of the primary monitor. It lasted only a fraction of a second before disappearing again, yet his expression changed almost imperceptibly. He had seen that exact sequence many years earlier under very different circumstances. Before he could speak, Principal Bennett entered the room with the lead inspector close behind. "Do we have any progress?" she asked. The senior technician slowly shook his head. Not yet. We are still searching for the source of the authentication conflict. Claire looked around the crowded room, trying to remain optimistic despite the growing pressure. Her eyes briefly met Ethan's. Thank you for keeping the rest of the building running smoothly, she said kindly. At least we do not have leaking pipes or broken doors to worry about today. Ethan nodded. Everyone is doing the best they can. Claire offered a grateful smile before turning back toward the inspectors. As the room filled once again with technical discussions, Ethan remained quietly in the doorway for one final moment, studying the frozen display with thoughtful eyes. He still said nothing, but for the first time that morning, he seemed to understand exactly where the real problem had begun. The technology office grew quieter with every unsuccessful attempt to restore the school network. Even the constant tapping of keyboards had slowed as experienced specialists stared at their screens with growing frustration. Principal Claire Bennett stood beside the lead inspector from the state board, listening carefully while trying to remain composed. The inspector closed his notebook for a moment and spoke gently. Mrs. Bennett, we understand technical failures happen. What we need to see is leadership under pressure. Claire nodded, although she felt the weight of every passing minute. We are doing everything possible. The senior technician leaned back in his chair and rubbed his tired eyes. The authentication server keeps rejecting valid certificates. We restore one service, and another immediately shuts down. It is almost as though the system is protecting itself from the repair. Another specialist quietly agreed. Every backup image reports healthy, but none of them will reconnect. Claire looked toward the wall clock. Less than 30 minutes remained before the inspection required full access to attendance records, student schedules, emergency contact information, and testing documentation. Without those systems, months of preparation could collapse before lunch. Outside the office, students continued moving through the hallways, unaware that the entire administrative foundation of their school had nearly stopped functioning. Ethan Walker slowly pushed his maintenance cart past the open doorway. He paused only long enough to notice another unfamiliar error message appear briefly on the largest monitor before disappearing again. His expression remained calm, but his eyes lingered on the screen a little longer than before. The sequence looked strangely familiar. He quietly remembered seeing almost the same pattern years earlier during a completely different chapter of his life, one he rarely allowed himself to revisit. Before he could continue walking, one of the younger technicians sighed loudly. I wish this machine would simply tell us what it wants. A few exhausted smiles appeared around the room. Ethan politely stepped one pace closer. May I ask a question? The technician looked up, surprised but courteous. Of course. Ethan pointed toward the monitor without touching anything. Did the authentication failure begin before or after the backup synchronization? The room became unexpectedly quiet. The technician blinked. After the synchronization, Ethan nodded thoughtfully. Did anyone verify whether the primary certificate cache rebuilt correctly before reconnecting the secondary directory? The specialists exchanged puzzled looks. One quietly answered, We assumed it had. Ethan smiled gently. Sometimes assumptions create very patient problems. The senior technician folded his arms. That is a very specific question. Ethan simply nodded. It seemed important. Claire watched the exchange with mild curiosity. She had never heard Ethan use technical language before. To her knowledge, he had always discussed boilers, paint, plumbing, and classroom repairs. The lead technician turned back toward his keyboard and opened another diagnostic window. His confident expression slowly changed into thoughtful concentration. Wait a minute, he murmured. He typed several commands before calling another specialist closer. Look at this. The certificate cache never completed rebuilding. The second technician leaned toward the monitor. How did we miss that? Ethan remained quietly beside the doorway with both hands resting on the handle of his maintenance cart. He said, Nothing more. The room filled once again with hurried discussion as the specialists followed the new lead. Several minutes passed before the senior technician slowly leaned back again. Unfortunately, even correcting that issue does not restore authentication. He sighed deeply. It explains one symptom, but not the source. Claire lowered her eyes for a brief moment. Hope had appeared only to fade once again. Ethan looked thoughtfully toward the frozen login screen. May I make one more observation? He asked politely. The technicians looked at him with renewed curiosity. Go ahead. the senior engineer replied. Ethan spoke with remarkable humility. The system is behaving as though two security policies are attempting to control the same authorization service. If that happened during an update, the server might reject every valid request because neither policy believes the other should exist. Silence settled across the office. One technician whispered almost to himself, "Dual policy conflict." Another immediately opened a different diagnostic console. His fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard before stopping. His eyes widened. There are two active authentication policies. The senior technician stepped beside him. That should be impossible. Apparently. The younger engineer replied quietly, "It is not." Claire looked from one specialist to another before turning toward Ethan. "How did you know to look there?" Ethan smiled modestly. "I have seen something similar before." The senior technician studied Ethan for a long moment. "Mr. Walker," he asked carefully, "have you worked with enterprise network systems?" Ethan hesitated just briefly before answering. "A long time ago." The technician looked back at the monitor, then once again toward Ethan. "Would you mind staying here for another minute?" Ethan nodded politely without taking a single step toward the computers. He had no interest in taking control of the room or proving anyone wrong. He simply waited with the same quiet patience that had defined his entire morning, while everyone else slowly began to realize the humble school janitor might understand far more about their crisis than anyone had ever imagined. The senior technology specialist slowly stood from his chair and looked directly at Ethan Walker with an expression that had completely replaced frustration with curiosity. "Mr. Walker," he said carefully, "would you mind explaining what you are seeing?" Ethan rested both hands on the handle of his maintenance cart before quietly answering. "Only if you believe it might help." The specialist gave a respectful nod. At this point, every idea is worth hearing. Principal Claire Bennett watched the exchange in silence. She had spent 7 years working in the same building as Ethan, yet this was the first time she had ever heard trained information technology professionals asking for his opinion. Ethan stepped toward the workstation without rushing. He remained standing instead of taking anyone's chair. "I would rather not interrupt your work," he said gently. "Just show me the authentication log from 5 minutes before the synchronization began." One technician quickly opened the requested records. Ethan studied the screen quietly. His eyes moved from one line to another with remarkable focus, almost as though he were reading a familiar language instead of thousands of technical commands. The room became unusually still. Even the inspectors who understood very little about network systems sensed they were watching something unexpected unfold. After nearly a minute of silence, Ethan pointed toward a single line buried among hundreds of others. "There." The younger technician leaned closer. "That warning." Ethan nodded. "It looks insignificant because it generated only once. But it interrupted the trust relationship before the update finished. Everything afterward became a symptom instead of the original problem." The senior specialist frowned thoughtfully. "We ignored it because the server marked it as informational." Ethan smiled politely. "Computers are honest. They usually tell us what happened. We simply decide which message deserves our attention." The room remained quiet for another moment. One of the inspectors slowly lowered his clipboard, fascinated by the calm confidence in Ethan's voice. Claire folded her arms, unable to hide her surprise. This was not someone guessing. This was someone who understood the system at an extraordinary level. The lead technician opened another diagnostic window and carefully followed Ethan's suggestion. Several commands later, he suddenly stopped typing. "I found it," he whispered. Another specialist hurried beside him. "What is it?" A corrupted trust certificate was duplicated during synchronization. Every security policy has been rejecting the other ever since. He looked back at Ethan with open amazement. "We spent nearly 2 hours chasing secondary failures." Ethan answered with his usual humility. "That happens more often than people realize." The younger technician smiled. "Can we repair it?" Ethan considered the screen for several thoughtful seconds. "Yes, but not by restoring another backup. You would recreate the same conflict." The senior engineer nodded slowly. "Then what would you recommend?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "If you temporarily isolate the duplicated policy, rebuild the certificate chain from the original root authority, and reconnect the directory only after verification, the remaining services should authenticate normally." Complete silence settled across the office. One technician quietly laughed in disbelief. That sounds exactly like the procedure our vendor manual recommends for enterprise recovery. Ethan simply smiled. It usually works. Claire finally spoke. Mr. Walker. She paused, searching for words. How do you know all of this? Ethan looked toward her with the same calm expression he carried every morning while sweeping hallways or repairing desks. I learned it a long time ago. Before Claire could ask another question, the senior technician looked at Ethan with genuine respect. Would you be willing to show us? Ethan immediately shook his head. This is your system. You should repair it. I will simply point you in the right direction if needed. The technician smiled appreciatively. Fair enough. Following Ethan's guidance, the team carefully isolated the duplicated policy, rebuilt the damaged certificate chain, and verified every authentication service before reconnecting the primary directory. Everyone in the room watched the progress indicators advance one careful step at a time. No one spoke. Even the soft humming of the servers suddenly seemed louder than usual. Finally, the primary monitor refreshed. The frozen login screen disappeared. A familiar welcome page appeared instead. One by one, additional systems reconnected automatically. Attendance records returned. Student schedules loaded. Emergency contacts synchronized successfully. Classroom devices began reporting online status across the building. Seconds later, printers throughout the school quietly resumed working. Teachers in distant classrooms looked at their computers with visible relief as green connection icons reappeared across their screens. The technology office erupted with grateful smiles, yet Ethan remained exactly where he had been standing. The senior technician slowly turned toward him. Mr. Walker, he said sincerely, I have worked in enterprise systems for 15 years. He paused before continuing. I have never seen anyone identify a root cause that quickly. Ethan offered only a modest smile. Sometimes experience teaches you where to look first. Claire looked from the restored monitors back to Ethan, her thoughts racing. She had believed she knew every member of her staff. Yet standing before her was a quiet school janitor whose understanding of advanced network architecture had just accomplished what an entire team of specialists had been unable to do. For the first time that morning, she realized the greatest mystery inside Jefferson High was no longer the failed computer system. It was the humble man who had quietly repaired it without asking for recognition. The atmosphere inside the technology office changed so completely that it almost felt like a different room. Only minutes earlier, worried voices had filled every corner as specialists struggled against an invisible problem that refused to reveal itself. Now every monitor displayed healthy system status. Attendance records synchronized successfully, classroom computers reconnected one after another, and relieved teachers began calling the office to report that everything was working again. Principal Claire. Bennett slowly released the breath she had been holding for nearly an hour. The lead inspector quietly closed his notebook and looked toward the restored dashboard with visible satisfaction. That, he said calmly, is an impressive recovery. Claire smiled politely, but her attention remained fixed on Ethan Walker. He had already stepped away from the workstation and returned to his maintenance cart as though nothing remarkable had happened. He adjusted the handle, picked up a roll of paper towels that had nearly fallen from the lower shelf, and quietly prepared to leave the office. Claire blinked in surprise. Mr. Walker, she called gently. Ethan stopped and turned with the same respectful smile he offered everyone each morning. Yes, Principal Bennett. Claire hesitated for a moment. You are leaving? Ethan nodded. There is still a leaking faucet in the art classroom, and the kindergarten hallway needs fresh paper in the bulletin boards before lunch. Several people in the room exchanged astonished glances. The senior technology specialist laughed softly. You just helped recover an enterprise network that had nearly shut down an entire school, and your next concern is a leaking faucet? Ethan smiled modestly. Students noticed leaking faucets too. Quiet laughter spread through the office, easing the tension that had dominated the morning. The lead technician stepped forward. Mr. Walker, I owe you more than a thank you. If you had not pointed us toward the root cause, we might still be searching hours from now. Ethan shook his head gently. You repaired the system. I simply noticed something familiar. The younger technician smiled. That sounds far more humble than accurate. Ethan answered with quiet sincerity. The solution belonged to everyone willing to keep looking. The state board inspector observed the conversation carefully before asking a simple question. Mr. Walker, Have you received formal technical training? The room became still once again. Claire looked toward Ethan with genuine curiosity. She realized she did not know the answer either. Ethan paused briefly before replying. Many years ago, yes. The inspector nodded thoughtfully. That explains your understanding. Ethan offered only a polite smile without adding another detail. He had never been interested in discussing his past unless it helped someone else. Claire watched him carefully as he walked into the hallway. For the first time since becoming principal, she found herself wondering how much of Ethan's story she had never bothered to ask. Outside the office, the familiar rhythm of school life had already begun returning. Students laughed between classes. Teachers resumed lessons with visible relief now that classroom technology functioned again. The announcement system chimed normally, and office assistants smiled each time another digital service reported successful recovery. Ethan quietly continued his own routine exactly as he had before the crisis began. He tightened a loose cabinet hinge in the music room, replaced a cracked ceiling tile above the library entrance, and stopped to help a third-grade student retrieve art supplies that had spilled across the hallway floor. "Thank you, Mr. Walker," the little girl said happily. Ethan handed her the last box of colored pencils. "You are very welcome. Have fun creating something beautiful today." She smiled and hurried toward class. Claire happened to witness the entire exchange from the opposite end of the hallway. She noticed something she had somehow overlooked for years. Students did not greet Ethan because he cleaned classrooms. They greeted him because he always made them feel important. Teachers trusted him without hesitation. Office staff smiled whenever he appeared. Even the cafeteria workers waved as he passed through the kitchen carrying replacement light bulbs. Respect had quietly followed him everywhere, yet he had never asked for it. Back inside the conference room, one member of the school board looked toward Claire. "The inspection appears to be back on schedule." Claire nodded. "Fortunately, yes." Another board member glanced at the staffing reports lying beside her folder. "We should still discuss maintenance reductions after the inspectors leave." Claire looked down at the recommendation form she had nearly completed earlier that morning. The paper suddenly felt much heavier than before. She slowly closed the folder without signing it. "Perhaps," she answered thoughtfully. "There are some people whose value cannot be measured by a job title." The board members exchanged puzzled looks, uncertain what had changed in only a few hours. Claire quietly watched Ethan disappear around the corner with his maintenance card, his steady footsteps echoing softly through the hallway. Somewhere beneath that ordinary blue work shirt and simple name badge was a story no one in the building seemed to know. She made a silent decision before the next inspection meeting even began. As soon as the school day ended, she intended to discover exactly who Ethan Walker had been before he ever became the quiet man pushing a maintenance cart through Jefferson High School. The final members of the inspection team completed their classroom visits just before noon, and for the first time since sunrise, Jefferson High School felt as though it could breathe again. Teachers smiled as they resumed their lessons without interruption. Students returned to familiar routines, and the office staff quietly celebrated every successful report that appeared on their computer screens. Principal Claire Bennett accompanied the lead inspector back toward the administration office, expecting a detailed review of the morning's unexpected crisis. Instead, the inspector paused beside the front hallway and looked through the glass doors where Ethan Walker was quietly replacing a faded welcome mat outside the entrance. "That gentleman," the inspector said thoughtfully, "seems unusually calm." Claire followed his gaze. Ethan knelt carefully, straightened the corners of the mat, brushed away a few fallen leaves carried in by the morning wind, then held the door open for a grandmother arriving to volunteer in the library. He smiled warmly, wished her a pleasant day, and returned to work without noticing anyone watching him. Claire nodded. "He has always been dependable." The inspector smiled gently. "Dependable is not the word I would choose after what I witnessed this morning." Claire remained silent. Deep inside, she agreed. The senior technology specialist soon entered, the office carrying his laptop. "Principal Bennett," he said respectfully, "I wanted to thank you again for allowing us to stay until everything was fully restored." Claire smiled. "We should be thanking your team." He hesitated before answering. "Actually, I think we should all be thanking Mr. Walker." Claire folded her arms thoughtfully. "You truly believe he understood the system better than anyone else?" The specialist laughed softly. "I do not merely believe it. I watched him identify a fault that none of us recognized after nearly 2 hours of investigation. That kind of diagnosis does not happen by accident. Another technician standing beside him nodded immediately. He recognized the root cause before he ever touched a keyboard. Claire looked genuinely puzzled. He barely touched the computer at all. Exactly, the technician replied. Experts who understand systems at that level usually need very little time. They already know what questions to ask. Those words lingered in Claire's thoughts long after the technicians departed. Throughout the afternoon, she found herself quietly observing Ethan whenever their paths crossed. He repaired a loose shelf in the kindergarten reading corner without being asked. He stopped to congratulate a student whose artwork had been displayed in the hallway. He helped the cafeteria manager move several heavy supply boxes into storage before returning a forgotten lunchbox to a first grader who had begun searching for it in tears. Every task received the same careful attention. Whether he was fixing a network problem or tightening a cabinet hinge seemed to make no difference to him. Each responsibility deserved his full effort. As the final school bell echoed through the building, students poured into the hallways carrying backpacks and laughing with friends. Lily Walker hurried toward the front entrance where Ethan waited beside his maintenance cart exactly as he did every afternoon. "Hi, Dad," she called happily. Ethan smiled as he accepted the stack of books she handed him. "How was your science quiz?" She grinned proudly. "I got every question right." "I never doubted you would," he replied. She noticed the tired expression on his face. "Did you have a busy day?" Ethan chuckled softly. "A little busier than usual." Before they could leave, Claire stepped into the hallway. "Mr. Walker," she said politely. Ethan turned immediately. "Good afternoon, Principal Bennett." Claire looked toward Lily and smiled warmly. "You must be Lily." The young girl nodded. "Yes, ma'am." Claire smiled. "Your father speaks very proudly of you." Lily looked up at Ethan with surprise. "You talk about me at work?" Ethan laughed quietly. "More often than you probably realize." Lily wrapped one arm around his shoulder, and Claire could not help smiling at the natural affection between them. After a brief pause, she looked back at Ethan. "Would you have a few minutes to speak with me tomorrow morning before classes begin?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "Of course." Claire hesitated, then added gently, "There are a few things I would like to understand." Ethan nodded with his familiar calm expression. "I will be here." As Ethan and Lily walked toward the parking lot together, Claire remained standing in the front hallway watching them disappear beneath the warm afternoon sunlight. The lead technology specialist's words continued echoing in her mind. Experts who understand systems at that level usually need very little time. She quietly returned to her office, opened Ethan Walker's personnel file for the first time since becoming principal, and immediately noticed how remarkably thin it was. Employment forms, background checks, emergency contacts, and maintenance certifications were neatly organized, yet almost nothing described the years before he accepted a position as the school's janitor. It was as though an entire chapter of his life had been intentionally left blank. Claire slowly closed the folder, more curious than ever. Tomorrow morning, she intended to ask a simple question that, without either of them realizing it, would begin uncovering a story far greater than anyone inside Jefferson High School had ever imagined. The next morning arrived wrapped in cool autumn air and pale golden sunlight that stretched gently across the front lawn of Jefferson High School. Ethan Walker parked his aging pickup truck in the same space he had used for years, picked up his worn maintenance bag, and unlocked the front entrance before anyone else arrived. The quiet hour before sunrise remained his favorite part of every day. He switched on hallway lights one section at a time, straightened chairs that had been left out after evening activities, and quietly greeted the school librarian as she arrived carrying a box of donated books. "Good morning, Mr. Walker," she said with a smile. "Good morning." Ethan replied warmly as he helped carry the box inside without being asked. Nothing about his routine suggested that only yesterday he had solved a technical crisis that had nearly brought the entire school to a standstill. To him, every morning deserved the same steady attention regardless of what had happened the day before. A few minutes later, Principal Claire Bennett stepped into the building carrying 2 cups of fresh coffee. She noticed Ethan replacing a burned-out light bulb near the main office and waited until he finished climbing down from the ladder before approaching him. "Good morning, Mr. Walker." Ethan smiled politely. "Good morning, Principal Bennett." She offered him one of the coffee cups. "I thought you might enjoy this before the students arrive." Ethan accepted it with genuine appreciation. Thank you. That is very thoughtful. Claire hesitated briefly before speaking again. Would you have a few minutes? Ethan nodded. Of course. They walked into her office, where the morning sunlight filtered softly through the large windows overlooking the football field. Claire closed the door, but intentionally left the blinds open. She wanted the conversation to feel respectful rather than secretive. Ethan remained standing until she invited him to sit. Even then, he rested quietly near the edge of the chair, his maintenance gloves folded neatly in his lap. Claire looked at him for a long moment before speaking. Yesterday raised several questions that I realized I should have asked years ago. Ethan smiled gently. Sometimes life becomes busy. Claire returned the smile. It does. Still, I feel I have spent 7 years working beside someone without truly knowing him. Ethan answered softly. Most people know exactly what they need to know. I clean classrooms, repair equipment, and try to help where I can. Claire leaned forward slightly. That is not all you do. Ethan remained silent. She continued carefully. The technology specialists were convinced you understood their network at an expert level. They were not exaggerating, were they? Ethan looked down at the warm cup of coffee resting in his hands before answering. No. Claire nodded slowly. Would you tell me how? Ethan remained quiet for several thoughtful seconds. Outside the office, students began arriving, their laughter drifting faintly through the hallway. Finally, he looked back at Claire with the same calm honesty that had guided every conversation throughout his life. Many years ago, computers were my profession. Claire listened without interrupting. I worked in educational technology before coming here. His answer was truthful, yet remarkably modest. Claire sensed immediately that it revealed only a small part of a much larger story. Educational technology can mean many things, she said gently. Ethan smiled. Yes, it can. Before either of them could continue, someone knocked lightly on the office door. The secretary stepped inside carrying a visitor sign and clipboard. Principal Bennett, she said. There is a gentleman here asking for Mr. Ethan Walker. He says he drove from Washington this morning and that the meeting is extremely important. Ethan looked genuinely puzzled. Washington? The secretary nodded. He would only tell me that he worked with you many years ago. Claire exchanged a curious glance with Ethan before standing. Please show him in. A few moments later, an older gentleman wearing a charcoal suit entered the office carrying a slim leather portfolio. The instant his eyes met Ethan's, his serious expression softened into a broad smile filled with unmistakable respect. Professor Walker, he said warmly, extending his hand. I finally found you. Complete silence settled over the room. Claire looked first at the visitor, then slowly back toward Ethan. The simple title echoed in her thoughts more loudly than any announcement she had ever heard inside the school. Ethan rose quietly from his chair, shook the man's hand with genuine warmth, and smiled with humble familiarity. Daniel, he said softly, it has been a very long time. Claire remained speechless. She had invited her school's quiet janitor into her office, expecting a conversation about hidden technical experience. Instead, she had just heard a complete stranger address him with a title that suggested the life Ethan Walker had left behind was far greater than anyone inside Jefferson High School had ever imagined. Daniel Harper continued holding Ethan Walker's hand for another moment before smiling with unmistakable admiration. I was beginning to think you had disappeared forever, he said warmly. Ethan chuckled softly. I simply chose a quieter life. Daniel nodded as though that answer explained everything. Principal Claire Bennett remained standing beside her desk, unable to hide the questions filling her mind. She had never heard anyone address Ethan as Professor Walker. The title sounded natural, almost familiar, as though it belonged to him. Daniel finally noticed Claire's puzzled expression and smiled politely. I apologize for arriving unexpectedly. My name is Daniel Harper. I currently serve as Director of Educational Innovation for the National Digital Learning Foundation. Claire shook his hand respectfully. Welcome to Jefferson High. Daniel looked back toward Ethan with a smile. I came because someone finally told me where to find the finest educator I have ever worked with. Ethan lowered his eyes with quiet embarrassment. You always enjoyed exaggerating. Daniel laughed gently. Not once. Claire slowly sat down, still trying to understand what she was hearing. Mr. Harper, she asked carefully, you called Mr. Walker a professor. Daniel looked genuinely surprised. You did not know? Claire slowly shook her head. No. Daniel turned toward Ethan. You never told them? Ethan smiled modestly. It never seemed important. Daniel gave a knowing smile before opening the leather portfolio he had carried into the office. Inside were several carefully preserved documents, photographs, and newspaper articles. He removed one framed photograph and placed it gently on Claire's desk. It showed a much younger Ethan standing in front of a university lecture hall filled with students. Behind him, a large screen displayed advanced computer architecture diagrams while hundreds of people applauded. Claire stared at the image in disbelief. This was taken at Westbridge Institute of Technology, Daniel explained. Professor Ethan Walker chaired the Department of Computer Science for nearly 8 years. Claire slowly looked up. Department chair? Daniel nodded. One of the youngest in the university's history. Ethan quietly folded his maintenance gloves together without saying a word. Daniel continued. Before that, he helped design secure educational technology systems that are still used by school districts across the country. Claire blinked. The same kind of systems that failed yesterday? Daniel smiled. Very similar. In fact, many of the security principles your district uses today were originally developed by Ethan and his research team. Silence filled the office. Outside the window, students crossed the courtyard carrying backpacks and laughing with friends, completely unaware that the quiet man who greeted them every morning had once helped shape the very technology supporting schools across America. Claire finally found her voice. If all of this is true, she paused, searching for the right words. Why would someone leave that life to become a school janitor? Daniel looked toward Ethan before answering. That story belongs to him. Ethan remained quiet for several thoughtful seconds. Morning sunlight rested gently across the office floor, and distant classroom bells echoed softly through the hallway. Finally he spoke. About 8 years ago, my wife, Sarah, became seriously ill. His voice remained calm, but every word carried quiet sincerity. For a long time we believed treatment would give us more years together. We were grateful for every day we had. Daniel respectfully lowered his eyes. Ethan continued. When Sarah realized she was running out of time, she asked me to promise her something. Claire listened without interrupting. She asked me to make sure our daughter never grew up wondering whether her father had chosen work instead of family. Ethan smiled gently as though remembering a conversation that still lived clearly in his heart. After Sarah passed away, I resigned from the university. People thought I had made a terrible mistake. I never believed that. Daniel nodded quietly. He declined research grants, executive positions, consulting contracts, and speaking invitations. Ethan gave a small shrug. Lily needed someone waiting for her after school. Claire looked toward the family photograph resting on the corner of Ethan's personnel file. She suddenly remembered seeing him every afternoon standing patiently beside the front entrance while students poured into the parking lot. She had assumed it was simply part of his routine. Now she realized it had been the fulfillment of a promise. Daniel carefully removed one final document from the portfolio. It was a newspaper feature with a large headline above Ethan's photograph. Claire slowly read the first line before looking back at him with astonishment. National Educator of the Year. Daniel smiled warmly. He accepted the award only because his students insisted. Ethan laughed softly. I still think they exaggerated. Daniel shook his head. They believed what every classroom eventually discovered. The greatest teachers never make learning about themselves. Claire looked at Ethan with entirely different eyes. The quiet man who repaired lockers, fixed leaking faucets, and greeted children every morning had once stood among the nation's most respected educators, yet he had never mentioned a single accomplishment. For the first time in her career as principal, Claire understood that true greatness often walks unnoticed through ordinary hallways, carrying a toolbox instead of a title, and choosing quiet service over recognition every single day. Daniel Harper carefully closed the leather portfolio and rested it on Principal Claire Bennett's desk. The office remained completely quiet. Even the sounds of students changing classes beyond the hallway seemed strangely distant, as though the building itself had paused to absorb everything that had just been revealed. Claire looked from the framed photograph to the newspaper article and finally back to Ethan Walker. The quiet man sitting across from her looked exactly the same as he had every morning for the past 7 years. His blue maintenance shirt showed faint traces of fresh paint near one sleeve. His work boots carried a little dust from the boiler room. Nothing about him suggested the remarkable career Daniel had just described. Yet somehow that ordinary appearance made the truth even more extraordinary. Claire slowly spoke. "Mr. Walker, why did you never tell anyone?" Ethan smiled gently. "Because no one hired me for who I used to be. They hired me to take care of this school." Claire lowered her eyes. The answer carried no bitterness. There was no disappointment, only quiet certainty. Daniel smiled warmly. "That is exactly why I always admired him." He reached into the portfolio once more and carefully removed another photograph. This one showed Ethan standing beside a group of young teachers inside a university classroom. Every face in the picture reflected genuine joy rather than formal ceremony. Daniel placed the photograph beside the first one. This was taken after Professor Walker finished training our newest faculty members. Nearly every person in this photograph eventually became a school principal, university dean, or educational leader. Claire studied the smiling faces before asking softly, "Did you teach all of them?" Ethan nodded modestly. "For a little while." Daniel laughed quietly. "You are still understating everything." He turned toward Claire. "Do you know what he told every new educator during orientation?" Claire shook her head. Daniel smiled before repeating the words from memory. "If your students remember your name but forget your kindness, then you have taught the wrong lesson." Ethan looked slightly embarrassed. "I had forgotten I ever said that." Daniel smiled. "None of us forgot." Claire quietly leaned back in her chair. She suddenly remembered dozens of ordinary moments from the past several years. Ethan helping a frightened first grader find a lost backpack. Ethan staying late to repair auditorium. Seats before a school play. Ethan shoveling snow from the sidewalks before sunrise so students could arrive safely. Ethan congratulating graduating seniors as though each success belonged to the entire school instead of the individual alone. She had always believed those actions reflected a dependable employee. Now she understood they reflected the heart of an educator who had simply exchanged one classroom for another. Daniel opened a small notebook that appeared even older than the newspaper article. "I carried this because I hoped one day I might return it to its rightful owner." Ethan looked at the notebook with immediate recognition. "I thought that disappeared years ago." Daniel smiled. "You left it in your office after resigning." He carefully handed it across the desk. Ethan slowly opened the worn cover. Inside were handwritten notes, lesson ideas, quotations, and reflections gathered throughout decades of teaching. Between 2 pages rested a faded photograph of Sarah smiling while holding Lily as a little girl. Ethan gently touched the picture before closing the notebook again. "Thank you for keeping this safe," he said quietly. Daniel nodded. "Some things deserve to be protected." Claire looked toward the family photograph with gentle understanding. "You really walked away from all of this without regret." Ethan answered without hesitation. "Every afternoon I was waiting outside this school. When Lily walked through those doors, I knew I had made the right decision." His voice remained calm, yet every word carried the quiet strength of a promise faithfully kept. Daniel smiled. Many people spend their entire careers searching for purpose. Ethan already knew where his purpose was. A light knock interrupted the conversation. The school secretary stepped into the office with an apologetic smile. "Principal Bennett, the district superintendent, just arrived unexpectedly. He heard about yesterday's network failure and would like to thank everyone who helped resolve it." Claire nodded. "Please ask him to come in." Moments later, Superintendent Michael Reynolds entered the office carrying a folder beneath his arm. He greeted Claire politely before turning toward Daniel. "Mr. Harper, I did not expect to see you here." Daniel smiled. "It has been a pleasant surprise." The superintendent's eyes then settled on Ethan. For a brief second, he stood perfectly still before an expression of complete astonishment spread across his face. Without the slightest hesitation, he crossed the office, extended both hands toward Ethan, and said with unmistakable respect, "Professor Walker, I cannot believe you have been here all this time. Half the educational technology systems in our district still rely on the framework you designed, and none of us realized the architect himself was quietly walking these hallways every single day." Superintendent Michael Reynolds remained standing with both hands wrapped firmly around Ethan Walker's, his expression filled with genuine admiration rather than surprise alone. "Professor Walker," he said once more, almost as if speaking the title helped him believe what he had just discovered. "When the district adopted our secure digital learning platform years ago, we studied your published architecture for months. Entire teams were trained using your research." Ethan smiled modestly. Many talented people improved those systems after I stepped away. Michael shook his head respectfully. Perhaps, but every improvement began with the foundation you designed. Principal Claire Bennett watched the exchange in complete silence. The quiet maintenance employee who had repaired lockers, shoveled sidewalks, and replaced ceiling tiles for 7 years was now being thanked by leaders whose names regularly appeared at educational conferences across the country. Daniel Harper smiled knowingly. I tried telling people that Ethan never really stopped teaching. He simply changed classrooms. Ethan lowered his eyes with quiet humility. Children notice much more than adults realize. Every hallway is a classroom if we choose to treat people with kindness. Claire felt those words settle deeply in her heart. She remembered countless mornings watching Ethan greet students by name, encouraging nervous freshmen on their first day, congratulating seniors before graduation, and quietly helping teachers long after the final bell without expecting recognition. She had admired his work ethic, yet she had completely overlooked the quiet leadership unfolding before her every day. Michael Reynolds slowly opened the folder he had carried into the office. Professor Walker, the district has spent years searching for someone willing to lead our statewide educational technology initiative. We have interviewed university presidents, software executives, and research directors. If you accepted the position, I believe every superintendent in the state would celebrate. Daniel smiled confidently. I suspected you would eventually ask. Claire looked hopefully toward Ethan, imagining the remarkable opportunities such a position would create. Ethan listened carefully without interrupting. When Michael finished speaking, he remained quiet for several thoughtful moments before answering with the same calm sincerity that had defined every conversation throughout the week. I am honored by your confidence. Michael smiled. Then you will consider it? Ethan looked toward the office window where students crossed the courtyard beneath bright autumn sunlight. Among them, he spotted Lily laughing with 2 friends as they carried science projects toward the classroom building. His face softened immediately. Several years ago, he said gently, I made a promise to my wife. The room became silent once again. I promised that our daughter would never wonder whether my career mattered more than she did. Michael nodded respectfully. Ethan continued, This school allows me to unlock the front doors before she arrives each morning and stand outside waiting when classes end each afternoon. Those moments may seem ordinary to everyone else, but to me they are the greatest success I have ever known. Daniel smiled with quiet understanding. Claire slowly lowered her eyes. She suddenly realized that while many people pursued larger offices, greater salaries, and prestigious titles, Ethan had spent years measuring success by something completely different. Michael closed the folder without disappointment. Instead, admiration replaced every trace of expectation. I understand, he said sincerely. Very few people know exactly what matters most. You clearly do. Ethan nodded gratefully. Perhaps one day my path will change again. Today it is exactly where it needs to be. Claire quietly stood and walked toward Ethan. Her voice carried unmistakable emotion. Mr. Walker, there is something I need to say. Ethan looked at her with gentle patience. Of course. She took a slow breath. Yesterday morning, I nearly allowed a budget discussion to reduce your position to nothing more than a number on a spreadsheet. I believed I understood the value each person brought to this school, but I was wrong. Ethan smiled kindly before she could continue. Principal Bennett, everyone makes decisions with the information they have. Claire slowly shook her head. No, I had something far more important than information. I had 7 years of opportunities to truly see the person standing in front of me, and I failed to do that. The office remained perfectly still. Daniel quietly looked toward the window while Michael respectfully stepped back, allowing the moment to belong entirely to them. Claire's eyes reflected both humility and gratitude. I am sorry that I saw your uniform before I saw your character. Ethan answered without hesitation. Then let us both be grateful that people can continue learning long after they become adults. A gentle smile appeared across Claire's face. It was the kind of smile that comes only after pride quietly gives way to wisdom. She extended her hand. Ethan accepted it warmly, not as a principal greeting an employee, but as one educator recognizing another. Outside the office, students continued filling the hallways with ordinary conversations, completely unaware that inside one small room, respect had replaced assumption, humility had overcome appearance, and a simple school janitor had just reminded every leader present that the finest lessons are often taught without standing behind a classroom podium. The conversation inside Principal Claire Bennett's office ended without fanfare, yet every person who walked out carried a quieter heart than the one they had brought inside. Superintendent Michael Reynolds shook Ethan Walker's hand one final time, before smiling warmly. "If you ever decide the time is right, the invitation will remain open." Ethan nodded with sincere appreciation. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Daniel Harper gathered the photographs and newspaper articles back into his leather portfolio, leaving only the small notebook on Ethan's desk. "That belongs with you now," he said softly. Ethan rested one hand on the worn cover and smiled. "I think Lily will enjoy reading it one day." Daniel laughed gently. "She deserves to know the teacher her father has always been." After the visitors departed, Claire remained standing near her office door while Ethan quietly picked up his maintenance gloves. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt respectful. Claire finally smiled. "There is one more thing I would like to ask." Ethan looked at her kindly. "Go ahead." She hesitated before continuing. "Would you consider speaking to our teachers during next month's professional development meeting? Not as a technology expert. Simply as the educator you have always been." Ethan looked thoughtful. "Only if they understand I still plan to spend the afternoon fixing classroom doors afterward." Claire laughed for the first time that morning. "I would expect nothing less." Ethan smiled. "Then I would be honored." As he stepped into the hallway, the ordinary rhythm of Jefferson High continued exactly as always. A science teacher asked whether he could repair a cabinet before tomorrow's lab. A student waved enthusiastically while carrying a trumpet toward band practice. The school nurse thanked him for adjusting a wheelchair ramp earlier that week. Ethan answered every greeting with the same warmth he had always shown. Nothing about his posture suggested that the district superintendent had just offered him one of the highest educational leadership positions in the state. Nothing about his expression reflected the national recognition hidden quietly behind his past. He simply continued serving the people in front of him. Later that afternoon, Claire walked through the building with entirely different eyes. She noticed details she had somehow overlooked for years. Ethan had placed small rubber protectors beneath classroom chairs so they would not scrape the floors or disturb students during lessons. He had painted colorful reading corner shelves at child height so younger children could reach books without asking for help. He had quietly repaired an old wooden bench beneath the large oak tree where anxious students often sat alone during lunch until it became one of the most welcoming places on campus. Every improvement carried the same signature. None of them displayed his name. None asked for recognition. They simply made life a little better for someone else. Claire paused outside the kindergarten hallway where Ethan knelt beside a little boy struggling to tie his shoes. Instead of quickly doing it himself, Ethan patiently showed the child each step until tiny hands completed the bow without assistance. "You did it," Ethan said proudly. The little boy smiled with joyful confidence. "I really did." Ethan nodded. "Now you can teach someone else someday." Claire quietly wiped a tear before continuing down the hallway. She finally understood what Daniel had meant. Ethan had never stopped teaching. His classroom had simply become much larger than anyone realized. As the final bell rang across Jefferson High, students poured into the hallways carrying backpacks, sports equipment, art projects, and musical instruments. Lily Walker appeared near the front entrance exactly where Ethan waited each afternoon beside his maintenance cart. "Ready to go home, Dad?" she asked cheerfully. Ethan smiled. "Almost." Before they left, Claire approached carrying a small envelope. "Mr. Walker," she said gently, "this belongs to you." Ethan accepted it with curiosity. Inside was a handwritten note. He unfolded the paper and read quietly. The message was simple. "Thank you for teaching this school long before we realized we had a teacher among us." Ethan looked up with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, Principal Bennett." She smiled warmly. "No, Professor Walker." Ethan chuckled softly and shook his head. "I think Mr. Walker still fits me just fine." Claire returned the smile. "Perhaps. But now we understand who has been walking these hallways all along." Together, Ethan and Lily stepped outside into the gentle afternoon sunlight. He placed the note carefully inside the old notebook Daniel had returned, then picked up his daughter's backpack before they walked toward the parking lot side by side. Behind them, the front doors of Jefferson High slowly closed, but something inside the building had quietly opened forever. From that day forward, the people who passed the humble maintenance man no longer saw only the uniform he wore. They saw the dignity with which he wore it, and that lesson became one no classroom could ever fully contain. 1 week later, the morning sun rose over Jefferson High School exactly as it always had, casting long bands of golden light across the sidewalks, while students hurried toward the front entrance with backpacks slung over their shoulders and coffee cups warming their hands against the crisp autumn air. Nothing about the building suggested that anything extraordinary had happened there only days before, yet those who walked through its hallways somehow carried themselves a little differently. Teachers smiled more often. Students greeted one another with greater patience. Even small acts of kindness seemed to spread naturally from one person to another, as though quiet goodness had become part of the school's foundation. Ethan Walker unlocked the front doors before sunrise as he had done every weekday for years. He checked the heating system, adjusted the American flag outside the entrance so it hung perfectly beneath the clear blue sky, replaced a burned-out light bulb in the library, and stopped to hold the front door open for a nervous freshman arriving early for an exam. "You are going to do just fine," Ethan said with his familiar reassuring smile. The student nodded gratefully before walking inside, with noticeably steadier steps. Principal Claire Bennett watched the brief exchange from her office window. She no longer saw a maintenance employee completing another ordinary task. She saw an educator shaping confidence without ever calling attention to himself. She quietly walked into the hallway carrying a small wooden plaque wrapped in simple brown paper. It was not expensive. It was not decorated with polished brass or elaborate engravings. It reflected exactly the kind of quiet dignity Ethan himself had always demonstrated. As faculty members gradually gathered before the morning staff meeting, Claire stood beside the entrance and waited until Ethan finished helping the cafeteria manager carry several heavy supply boxes through the kitchen doors. "Mr. Walker," she called gently. Ethan turned with the same warm smile he offered every morning. "Good morning, Principal Bennett." Claire held out the wrapped package. "Our staff asked if you would accept a small gift." Ethan looked surprised. "You did not need to do that." "Perhaps not," Claire answered softly. "But we wanted to." Ethan carefully unfolded the paper. Inside rested a simple wooden plaque with only one sentence carved into the polished oak. It read, "The greatest lessons are often taught by the quietest teacher." No name appeared beneath the words. No title appeared above them. Ethan looked at the plaque for several silent moments before smiling with unmistakable gratitude. "It is beautiful," he said quietly. Claire smiled. "We thought you might understand why we chose those words." Ethan nodded gently. "I do." Before anyone could say another word, the hallway began filling with students arriving for first period. One by one, they greeted Ethan as they passed. "Good morning, Mr. Walker." "Morning, sir. Thank you for fixing the art room. My locker works perfectly now." None of them mentioned awards, universities, research, or national recognition. They simply thanked the man who had always treated them with kindness. Ethan answered every greeting exactly as he always had, never allowing admiration to change the quiet rhythm of his character. A few minutes later, Lily joined him near the front entrance carrying her science notebook beneath one arm. She noticed the wooden plaque resting against the maintenance cart and smiled proudly. "Did the school give that to you?" Ethan nodded. They were very thoughtful. Lily read the words carved into the wood before looking up at her father. "I think Mom would have liked it." Ethan's smile softened with peaceful remembrance. "I think she would have reminded me that every kind word belongs to the people who inspired it." Lily slipped her hand into his as the first bell echoed gently throughout the building. Claire watched father and daughter for another quiet moment before returning to the morning meeting. Inside the faculty room, she placed a small handwritten card beside the attendance folder where every teacher would see it before classes began. It contained only one sentence. "Never measure a person's worth by the uniform they wear. Measure it by the lives they quietly improve." No signature appeared beneath the message because everyone already knew exactly where the lesson had come from. Throughout the weeks that followed, Jefferson High changed in ways no inspection report could ever measure. Teachers learned the names of every custodian, cafeteria worker, bus driver, and office assistant. Students thanked the maintenance staff instead of walking past them without notice. Parents smiled at the people who opened doors before school and locked them again long after evening events ended. Respect quietly expanded beyond titles and positions until it became part of the school's culture. Ethan never asked whether people remembered his past, because he had never believed the past defined the value of the present. Each morning, he still unlocked the front doors before sunrise. Each afternoon, he still waited outside for Lily when the final bell rang. He still repaired broken desks, replaced ceiling tiles, fixed leaking faucets, and encouraged frightened students with the same patient smile that had greeted them for years. His extraordinary accomplishments remained safely tucked away inside an old notebook resting on a shelf at home, while the life he treasured unfolded in ordinary moments shared with the people standing directly in front of him. And perhaps that became the greatest lesson of all. Wisdom does not become greater because the world finally notices it. Kindness does not become more valuable because someone discovers impressive titles hidden behind humble work. True greatness has never depended on applause. It quietly reveals itself through faithful service, gentle character, and the courage to choose love over recognition every single day. Long after memories of inspections, awards, and forgotten headlines disappeared, Jefferson High continued remembering one simple truth. The finest teacher in the building had never needed a classroom to change lives.